So, an introduction to Paul. So Paul is the risk manager for SIL, which provides specialist support and recovery services to those with severe mental health problems, and that includes people with a forensic history, a diagnosis of personality disorders, drug and alcohol abuse, so really complex needs. And Paul's work speaks to really the message that even in the face of complex needs and complex histories, there is still choice, opportunity, and hope. So, Paul, welcome to the stage. Oh, we have a double act. Yes, so may I ask you to introduce yourself? Yeah, a round of applause, please, welcoming our next speakers.
How does that work? Brilliant, okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm not Paul Deacon. I'm Richard Cunningham. I'm the Development Director for Lifeways SIL and also a shameless exhibitionist, basically. So I've muscled in with some sharp elbows in front of Paul. Basically, I just wanted to introduce our organisation really to you, and then I'll hand over to Paul for the main presentation. Now, is it next? Yeah. We've seen some quite impressive presentations so far, so I'll apologise in advance. I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, so my presentation is pretty, well, certainly the animations I use, I'm quite ashamed of really now, having seen what's gone before. So, Lifeways SIL, who are we? Does it work? Oh yeah, we're a member of the Lifeways group. So Lifeways are the largest provider of supported living in the country, basically. We are also, this is hot off the press, we're part of Lifeways' newly formed mental health division, and what we're looking forward to doing in the future is providing a kind of holistic approach to mental health with different streams of provision for people at different, who are in need of different support. We are, though, a specialist mental health supported living provider, and that basically means that we only do mental health. We don't do a range of other things, so for example, LD and so on. We set out originally to address some things that we thought were missing in the system and to do what we did well. And since 2014, so this is our slightly clunky original mission statement, which was made up in a kitchen in Dorset, basically, between me and our then MD, Martin Bogan. And it kind of resonates a bit with what Dr. Caldindi said this morning, really. We felt at the time there were a lot of people who were stuck in hospitals and other situations who, because they were seen to be problematic or complex, or were seen to be potentially, or staff were potentially fearful, these individuals weren't getting the access to the community support. I'm a big believer, and as a company, we're a huge believer that actually recovery really does begin in the community, really. If you get people back, let's get people back home, close to the home, in the least restrictive environment, give them the power to take control for themselves, and actually you'll see tremendous outcomes. And we're recovery-focused, strength-based, and trauma-informed, as hopefully you'd expect us to be. The people we support, and this sort of underpins what we're about to talk about, what Paul's going to talk about this afternoon. So we set out to look at those individuals who are the most complex, really. So 28% of the people have a significant background offence. 33 have an MOJ history, majority with continued restrictions. 33% have a fire-setting history or a conviction for arson. And 40% have a historic substance misuse problems. And the majority have never had a tenancy. And I think if you can understand, with that kind of cohort with our estate, and we run 25 services, a network of 25 services nationwide, we're big believers in partnership working. And I'm going to hand over to Paul at this point, really. If you have any questions, we are in the lobby. Please do come and see us. We're really keen to talk to people and talk about how we can partner up as well.
Thank you. My name is Paul Deacon, Risk Manager for SIL Lifeways. I am a bit of a talker, so I'm going to stick to my script. Okay, and Richard's here to sort of give me a prompt. Yeah, I'm also from Wales. My mother was, I'm the youngest of 6 children, so we learned how to talk in Wales, a lot. Okay. I am going to stick to the script, so I might seem a bit wooden at times, but just in the interest of time, etc. An approving nod there from. Yeah. I believe all of us understand and acknowledge that community partnership initiatives can reduce the cycle of hospital admissions and evictions many people with complex mental health issues endure. However, recent government inquiries and serious safeguarding reports consistently reminds us of the difficulty community services have in respect to partnership working when difficult scenarios arise. I would like to draw your attention to a recently published inquiry into a service named Stella Maris in Suffolk. For me, this inquiry highlighted the continuing resistance to whole system working, especially when providers of support are struggling to manage very complex and challenging situations. The Stella Maris supported living service was for tenants with complex needs and chaotic lifestyles. The report stated that it was opened hurriedly in December 2018 without sufficient due diligence and scenario planning for the cohort of service users who were moving in. The inquiry outlined that the needs of some tenants far exceeded the capacity and capability of the service that was commissioned to look after them. No compatibility checks were completed. Staff training did not match the challenges or needs within the service. The housing application process was poorly administered by the spot purchasers, the care providers, and by the housing association. So this is a letter from a gentleman, a young chap who lived in the service, and it pretty much details the torrid time he had whilst living in the service for the short period he was there. So with regards to the service, in brief, what ensued was 18 months of chaos, which impacted heavily on the service users, the local community, emergency services, and the team within the service. There were hundreds of calls to emergency services, literally hundreds. It was, you know, if you look into the report, I think there was about 300 emergency services calls within less than a year. Several service users had to return to hospital, be readmitted, and a large number lost their tenancies. This letter was a chronology of the day-to-day experience of a service user. In addition to safeguards raised by service staff, agencies and members of the community, it also triggered safeguards which were not addressed or on the most part not investigated. The service user's account outlined the incredibly unsafe situation was playing out within the building. Clearly, mistakes were made by the provider, but as the author, Anthony Douglas, reported, Stella Maris highlighted the poor degree of partnership working and a culture of self-interest first by agencies and authorities within the region. And that's a quote from the report itself. The photograph here, this was on BBC News, was actually of a service user with a severe mental illness who decided to live outside of the service in a tent. And he lived there for quite a while until somebody intervened. The Stella Maris inquiry offers multiple points of reference in respect of the lack of whole system working. As a provider, we certainly have not had the challenges of a service such as Stella Maris, but I have drawn 3 points from the inquiry as they are sadly familiar to our organisation when we have had significant emerging challenges or events within individual service users. Point 1, none of the agencies involved communicated adequately. We as a provider can often act as the catalyst or the orchestrator of communications between different agencies and authorities. We often lead when there's quite serious emerging risks within the community. Point 2, shortfalls in communication and multi-agency working led to the lack of coherent planning and overuse of the emergency services. We all know that service users with complex mental health needs need to feel that stakeholders are working together to keep them safe. When support planning appears unrealistic, limited or weak, service users can feel unsafe and thus seek help from emergency services or a return to the security of a hospital environment. Point 3, the professionals went their own way, acting independently of each other and responding to the immediate problem in front of them without seeing the bigger picture. And again, all these are quotes from the inquiry report. This, for me, is the area which is most common when service users are presenting with very risky behaviours. Agencies and authorities often seek to address the problem which they feel are accountable for. But as we see regularly, if all the service users' challenges are not addressed collectively through partnership working, the problems which were believed to have been addressed will re-emerge. This model is what quickly established itself at Stella Maris. Ultimately, solving the issues was the service provider and the landlord's problem. The only option in this case for the provider was to evict the problematic individuals. And we've already had a conversation this morning with regards to individuals not having the right provider or the right sort of environment for people to move into. Unfortunately, albeit certainly to a lesser degree than the situation which developed in Stella Maris, this model of the provider becoming the focus of the problem and the hub for interdisciplinary communications is very familiar to me in my role. We have had cases where very complex situations have occurred and have clearly needed a broad-ranging, multidisciplinary approach and very fluid communications to prevent service users from suffering or service users becoming a danger to all around them. In some cases, we've had anti-terrorist police in service, prevent multiple, quite serious events that were emerging, but we've been sort of left isolated. Typically, it's taken an immense effort to get people to link together and communicate. Now, if we don't communicate, if we haven't done that, a lot of our service users would have ended up in hospital, or the situation would have got a lot worse. It's very similar to Stella Maris. This was recommendation 11 from the Stella Maris inquiry report. The inquiry report was very clear when outlining how joint working was overall absent for 18 months. Ultimately, it required a senior figure from the local authority to eventually draw people together to address the situation. Recommendation 11 of the inquiry report refers to how the pandemic period, and we've already spoke about this, the doctor was talking about his ECGs and how things sort of, barriers were brought people together more effectively and joint working improved. For us, the pandemic did see an improvement in day-to-day interactions. Communications and efforts to work closer together really improved. But post-pandemic, adjustments in statutory service structures, agency support frameworks and local authority practices have, in our view, fragmented partnership working again. This is in the face of new community challenges such as the residual effects of the pandemic, a growth in substance misuse, and of course, the cost of living crisis. I very recently attended an online conference on crisis management. This quote pretty much summed up the challenges facing services such as ours post-pandemic. Our data clearly shows that increasing numbers of previously rare events within our service correlates with new emerging community risks. Substance misuse is changing. There is a significant escalation in challenges created by a growing cohort of service users with personality disorders. Service users are more readily disengaging from community support. Crisis situations are more common, and there appears to be an expanding cohort of service users who have very poor living skills. This is combined with difficulties with individual finances, stretched emergency services, limited drug and alcohol support, and what appears to be an acceptance of a higher threshold of risk before an admission to hospital is supported. This picture here pretty much sort of echoes what the doctor today sort of highlighted when there's poor provision and a lack of support. And a lot of our service users who come to our service have never had a tenancy. They leave hospital with very little support, and this is the outcome. This is not one of our services, by the way. Okay. We offer our service users assured tenancies. The vast majority, with balanced support from our teams and the landlord, learn to manage themselves and their tenancies very well. However, our governance systems and referral data highlights that most of our service users have never had a tenancy or have been moved on from several of the providers because they have become unwell or associated with illicit substance misuse. Working closely with housing management services is essential to prevent evictions after a crisis. But landlords need to be reassured all stakeholders are coming together to keep their properties and other residents safe. Post-pandemic assessment and referral data. So part of my role is to collect data around issues and events around the organisation. Suggests that there are changes in the complexity of service user diagnosis. We are witnessing an expanding cohort of service users with co-occurring disorders who need extensive and continuing support in many aspects of their life. For example, presently around 40%, as Richard said, of our referrals have long histories of illicit substance misuse and alcohol abuse. This has resulted in the need for adjustments and changes being made day to day by support practices. Housing and flat management, risk governance and data around apartment challenges indicates a change in strategy to prevent service users from falling foul of housing agreements. I hope that makes sense. If I was to summarise or draw together the changing face of complex mental health support in the community, it would be these 5 areas. I just wanted to make sure that you leave today with some of the experiences as a provider we're having now, the new world, and it is a different world after the pandemic. Firstly, the mode of illicit substance misuse is changing. Dealers are much more sophisticated. They use online apps, they have secret sort of links for service users to acquire substances. They're much more organised than ever before. There's the issue of cuckooing, and for those who don't know what cuckooing is, it's when a county lines people move into areas and they target our vulnerable people. They look for them, and our service users have an assured tenancy, so they are praised. But luckily, our staff are well aware of this, and they sort of guard with pitchforks and flames around the service, looking out for individuals. But we have been close, we have been close with individuals, service users who have friends who've turned out to be major drug dealers. Products have now become expensive. They were very cheap after the pandemic. People were storing cocaine and all these different products in their fridges, in their grandma's fridges. Yeah, they've been waited till the festivals and the pubs open, and then they've begun to be sold readily, and service users reported very cheap cocaine and other psychostimulants. However, as dealers and people who run the drugs market, prices have gone up markedly. So service users who once used cocaine and other drugs can't use these anymore, and they've gone to less expensive drugs. So debts have become significant, and therefore service users seek cheaper and more dangerous substances, such as benzodiazepines. And I give a warning to everybody now who's a provider, works in the community. Pregabalin is a very dangerous substance, and it seems to be in vogue at the moment. And when mixed with, I see people nodding their head and laughing. When mixed with clozapine and other psychotic disorder drugs, it can be extremely dangerous, and we've had a couple of near misses. So benzodiazepines are very cheap. Pregabalin, please watch out for that. Cheap psychostimulants such as crack cocaine, that seems to be the drug now that people are referring to. Secondly, service users can disengage from support more readily and are therefore closed down by agencies. We have more complex service users than ever without a named care coordinator or a social worker. Thirdly, self-neglect, flat management, poor skills and personal care issues are more common. As said, referrals during and after the pandemic show that many more service users have a history of struggling to manage tenancies in themselves. Fourthly, historic arsonists and fire setters are subject to a lower level of tolerance from housing managers. We have a relatively large cohort of such service users where if they have small breaches, even the minutest sort of indication that there's a fire safety risk, they can quickly result in the tenancy being threatened or property seized. Fifthly, personality disorder referrals have usually increased. Self-harm activity That has impacted massively on emergency services. I was talking to somebody from emergency service recently about the number of call-outs for ambulance services, how they've increased since the pandemic. Multiple safeguard reports and impact on staff teams have required increased resources and practice adjustments. This issue, combined with changing world of drug misuse, really for me encapsulates the growing need to work as a whole system in the community. For me, the concept of establishing a whole system culture of working is not a complex one. Some of you might disagree. The issue simply lies in the difficulty services, agencies and authorities have in interacting with each other. Just give an example. This guy here came to one of our services about 4 years ago. He was stuck in hospital. One of the commissioners identified him with several others, and they are openly telling people they will use drugs. They will use MDMA when they leave the service. Yeah, without getting people together around the table, we wouldn't have got this guy out. Yeah, and now he's just finished his MVQ in hairdressing. And he's moving on. He's got himself a girlfriend. He's moving on. But that took a lot of partnership working. So, if I was to summarise when we have come together to successfully help people with complex needs, very briefly, it will be firstly promote regular multidisciplinary reviews when needed, fortnightly in the most exceptional of risky cases where we track and address the issues. Establish drug and alcohol support links. Now that happened, there was commission for this service. Somebody regular, the guys knew, came to the service day in, day out, and they supported, they talked to the guys, they talked to them in an open way about drug use. These can be just brief visits to services or dialogue online to get advice on approaches to emerging problems. So staff had a bit of a line to the drug treatment and alcohol service just to get some advice. Meet local stakeholders, that's really important. Simply create a network and communicate. We've had vicars, counsellors, all different people from around the community who understand that we have a service, mental health service in their area, and how can they help us? What can they do for us? And they have. They've been excellent in some cases. In other cases, though, regionally, it can be more difficult. People don't want a mental health service there. Co-produce plans and strategies, simply agree on the intended outcome and plan together to achieve it. And share information. Working closely with agencies has reduced the need for emergency services and has allowed everyone to understand what the bigger picture is. The elements of what whole system working should look like is a healthy debate to have, and I'll leave you guys to go away and talk about that. But these elements are crucial and were identified by the Golden Key Partnership in Bristol area, and indeed in many other partnerships that have sadly now ended. Ironically, they ended before the pandemic, and there's not re-emerged. It is alarming that in the face of growing community risks and the escalating demands on all community services, partnership working is seemingly more disjointed than ever, or at a minimum, very difficult to establish. So to that end, and I can see you sort of drifting off, some people. If we do not work together as a whole system, more people will lose their homes, more people will be caught in the admission to discharge cycle, and as we saw with Stella Maris, the whole community as well as the service users will suffer. That's it from me, guys. Thank you. Thank you.